They tell you the Emperor protects. It's the first thing drilled into your skull, whispered like a prayer painted across every wall. But no one ever says what he's protecting you from. I learned that truth when the sky turned the color of rot and the ground itself began to scream. My name doesn't matter anymore. What matters is that I've spent 14 years bleeding for a throne I'll never see fighting enemies I can barely name. If you think being a soldier is glory, let me show you why it's worse than death. Chapter 1. The Lie That Recruited Me. They called it opportunity, service, glory, but in truth it was nothing more than a contract written in blood. I was born in the underhive of Moria Prime, a place where the sun never reached the ground and the air was thick with rust smoke and desperation. Down there, a name meant nothing. Survival was your only currency. And when the recruitment officer came clean boots gleaming against the filth of our streets, I thought he was a messenger from a better world. He spoke of honor, of defending humanity, of standing shoulder to shoulder with legends. He told us we would be part of something greater, that the Emperor himself would look upon us with pride. His voice was smooth, his uniform immaculate, and his promises sounded like salvation. We believed him not because we were naive, but because hope is the only luxury the underhive ever sells. The truth is simple. He needed numbers, bodies to fill the ranks, warm hands to carry rifles, hearts still beating to be fed into the machine. I didn't know that then. I only knew that signing meant food shelter and the chance to escape a life where tomorrow was never guaranteed. Boot camp stripped away the last illusions. 6 months of rain so toxic, it ate through skin drill sergeants who treated us like raw metal to be hammered into shape. Endless chants reminding us that individuality was weakness. They broke us down piece by piece until we no longer remembered what it meant to say, I. What remained was, we a unit faceless, obedient, expendable. We learned how to march in perfect rows while our stomachs cramped with hunger. How to dismantle and reassemble a laser gun, blindfolded fingers bleeding from repetition. How to follow orders without question, even when those orders contradicted reason, morality, or survival. They taught us that pain was temporary, but discipline was eternal. That mercy was treason. That hesitation was death. I remember the first time the instructors forced us to fire on human silhouettes. Not Xenos, not heretics, just wooden cutouts painted to look like ordinary men and women. Mothers, workers, children. The targets were unarmed, their faces crudely drawn in expressions of fear. We pulled the triggers anyway. The instructors told us it was training preparation for the rebels and collaborators we would one day meet. But the lesson was deeper. They wanted us to understand that the enemy could wear any face, even one that looked like our own. The breaking point came sooner than I expected. Our first deployment wasn't against Orks or Chaos, but against civilians on Heathguard. Imperial citizens raised under the same banners, fed on the same lies. They wanted freedom, the right to govern themselves, to breathe air, untainted by bureaucracy. For that crime, we were ordered to pacify them. Pacification. Such a clean word for what it really meant. Slaughter. Entire districts burned to ash bodies, piled like refuse families, executed because they dared to dream of something beyond servitude. It was there I killed my first man. He couldn't have been older than 20, wearing the wrong uniform, but the same fear I had seen in every recruit's eyes. He bled red like the rest of us, gasped for breath like the rest of us, and when he died, he looked like a boy who should have been at home tending crops or learning a trade. My hands shook when it was over. The instructors had told us killing would feel righteous. Instead, it felt empty, wasteful, wrong. But in war, wrong doesn't matter. Only survival does. We were told that the Emperor's light shone on us as we executed our own kind. Commissars lectured about duty, about protecting humanity from itself, while the stench of burning promethium clung to our uniforms. The dissonance should have driven us insane. Instead, it trained us, conditioned us to accept the unacceptable, to obey without thought, to silence the voice inside that still whispered the word murder. That was the first and most important lesson of service truth is whatever your commanding officer says it is. I carried that lesson in my pack, alongside my laser gun, heavier than any rations or gear. Every order after that was easier to follow because I had already stepped across the line. Killing aliens, mutants, heretics, those were simple compared to the day I pulled the trigger on someone who might have been my neighbor. The propaganda promised we would become heroes. The reality was we became efficient. Efficient at erasing lives, efficient at suppressing doubt, efficient at pretending we were more than disposable weapons in a war without end. They gave me a number, a rank, and a weapon. The weapon was real. The rest was theater. My serial code mattered more than my name. The regiment's kill count mattered more than its survival rate. And somewhere along the line, I stopped asking why. It's easy to judge a soldier from the outside, to say we should have resisted, should have questioned, should have stood up against injustice. But you don't understand what it means to be forged in the crucible of endless war. Choice is a luxury, morality is a liability, and hesitation gets men killed. I signed away my life for a lie, and I've been paying the interest ever since. The uniform was the only truth the recruiter ever told me. It was real, it fit, and it bound me tighter than chains. When I put it on, I ceased being Cadius Vex, gutter-born scum of the Underhive. I became Trooper Vex, one voice in a chorus that would scream across 1,000 battlefields. Looking back, I wonder if that boy in the Underhive understood what he was trading. I wonder if he'd still take the deal, knowing what was coming. The bodies, the nightmares, the silence that follows every firefight. Maybe he would. Because when you're born with nothing, even a lie can feel like salvation. Chapter 2, Baptism by Slaughter. They called it the Heathguard Pacification Campaign. A clean phrase, sterile, stamped with the seal of the Departamento Militarum. What it really meant was genocide. We touched down in acid rain. The drops hissed on armor plates, gnawed at exposed skin, and turned the ground into a bubbling stew of chemicals. The rebels had sabotaged the atmospheric processors before our arrival, choking their own world to deny it to us. Every breath felt like inhaling rusted nails. Rebreathers were in short supply, filters already clogged. Most of us learned to breathe through our mouths and pretend the fire in our lungs was just another kind of discipline. Complaints were weakness. Weakness meant punishment. Colonel Marcus Vra was our commanding officer. He was a man carved out of stone and sharpened into a blade. No shouting, no rage, just cold precision. Success to him was measured in body counts and completed objectives. If we lost 30 men but advanced 2 kilometers, he called it efficient. If we lost 100 but took a manufactorum intact, he called it victory. Emotion was weakness. Compassion was treason. We feared him more than we feared the enemy because the enemy wanted us dead quickly. Vra believed in discipline through exhaustion. 20 kilometers of marching every day, full kit in rain that stripped the paint from our weapons. 4 hours of sleep in every 24. Rations that tasted like wet cardboard laced with ash. If you complained once, you were given double duties. Complained twice, flogging. 3 times, you disappeared. On Heathguard, disappearing was easy. We lost 30% of our strength in the first month. Not to enemy fire, but to accidents, collapsing structures, reactor pits, stress incidents. That's what the medics called it when a man put his own last pistol in his mouth or when he wandered into a moving tank column without warning. The truth was simpler. Minds broke faster than bones. I remember Trooper Kellen, farm boy from Thessia, wide eyes, calloused hands. At first, he just glanced nervously at his squad mates, muttering under his breath. Then he started accusing us of poisoning his rations, tampering with his gear. One morning during inspection, he lunged at Sergeant Herrick with a bayonet. The commissar didn't hesitate, 1 bolt round to the head, clean, efficient. We left his body where it fell. No time for burial, no energy for grief. Herrick wiped the blood from his uniform and gave the next order. That was the day I stopped thinking of us as soldiers. We weren't heroes. We weren't even men. We were munitions loaded, fired, and discarded when faulty. The Imperium had no shortage of worlds to draw recruits from. No shortage of desperate hands willing to trade life for uniform. What it lacked was time. And time was always the enemy we couldn't beat. The rebels fought like cornered animals. They had captured lasguns, makeshift explosives, and the fury of people who knew they were already dead. They melted into the ruins of their own cities, sniping from shattered windows, planting mines under rubble, turning every alley into an ambush, and every corridor into a killing field. We called them disorganized. In truth, they were smarter than us. They knew the ground. They knew they had nothing to lose. That makes a man dangerous. My second kill came in a maintenance tunnel lit only by the faint red glow of hazard lamps. He was maybe 16, legs shredded by shrapnel crawling away, leaving a trail of blood across rusted metal. When I leveled my lasgun, he closed his eyes. Didn't beg, didn't curse, just waited. For 3 seconds I hesitated, not out of mercy, but out of a crushing sense of waste. He could have been anything, builder, husband, father. Instead, he was another corpse in a tunnel that stank of coolant and sewage. Training took over. I pulled the trigger. His chest lit up. His heart stopped. He died with his eyes shut, dreaming of home. That night, I lay in my bunk and tried to count how many I had killed since arrival. Direct kills were easy, but what about the artillery strikes I called in the air support? I requested the intelligence reports that led to bombardments. By any honest math, dozens were dead because of me. Most I would never see, never know. Counting was madness. So I stopped counting. The arithmetic of war is simple: kill the enemy before the enemy kills you. Everything else is philosophy, and philosophy is a luxury soldiers cannot afford. We spent 11 months on Heathguard, 11 months of urban warfare, counterinsurgency, and propaganda disguised as morale operations. Morale meant public executions, deportations, burning libraries, tearing down statues, erasing history so that the world itself forgot who it once was. We weren't just conquering, we were erasing. By the end, Heathguard didn't look like the same planet. The cities were skeletons of ash and ferrocrete. The people were dead, displaced, or re-indoctrinated. The manufactoria were demolished so they could never rise again. Official reports called it a complete success. Strategic objectives achieved, acceptable losses, minimal expenditure, acceptable, minimal. Words as cold as the man who wrote them. For me, the reward was a promotion, Lance Corporal. A larger bunk, a few more credits, responsibility for breaking in the next recruits. It also meant complicity. I wasn't just obeying anymore. I was giving orders. Orders that sent green boys to die in the same alleys where I had watched the life drain out of a 16-year-old. That was the real baptism, not the first kill, not the first battle, but the moment I realized I was invested, that there was no going back, that the uniform was not just cloth and insignia, it was a contract written in flesh. Heathguard taught me the truth of war. Not glory, not honor, only slaughter. Systematic, necessary, endless. And once you've baptized yourself in that kind of blood, you can never be clean again. Chapter 3. The Green Tide. The transport ship that carried us from Heathguard stank of oil and exhaustion. We told ourselves the next deployment would be easier. It wasn't. It never is. Our destination was Karax Prime, a hive world rotting at the edges of Imperial control. Intelligence had whispered of Ork raiders. What we found was worse, a planet infected. Their spores clung to walls, sprouted in shadows, drifted in the very air. Karax wasn't occupied. It was incubating. The first week passed quietly, too quietly. Patrols through ruined hab blocks, looters hiding in shadows, the stench of smoke and metal thick enough to taste. That's when we began to find the collaborators, humans who had bartered survival by serving greenskins. Better fed, better armed tattoos cut into their flesh in crude glyphs. Some claimed they'd been forced, others wore their treachery like pride. Colonel Vraz's standing orders were clear summary execution, no trial, no debate. The definition of willful was left to us, which meant every guardsman carried the weight of judge, jury, and executioner. I killed my first collaborator on a Tuesday. His name was Hrick Voss, a middle-aged clerk who had cataloged which buildings held resources for Orks to plunder. He told me he was saving lives, that without his compliance the greenskins would have burned everything. I almost believed him, but belief doesn't change orders. One lacerround through his skull. His wife, 7 months pregnant, watched from a window. His children screamed but stayed silent. I told them to dispose of the body. Civic duty, technically. That night I dreamed of him whispering excuses that sounded like prayers. The dreams lasted for months. It was a cruel warm-up. The real nightmare came weeks later, heralded by a sound you never forget. The guttural roar of a wag. 10,000 orcs descended on our position like a living avalanche. We had 600 men, half our equipment barely functional. Do the math, it wasn't a battle. It was suicide delayed. The first wave came at dawn. Engines belching black smoke vehicles, cobbled together from rust and lunacy. Their weapons shouldn't have worked, but they did, fueled by some obscene mixture of faith and brutality. We poured last fire into their ranks until our barrels glowed. They just laughed. They fed on the violence, grew stronger with every death. Killing them was like trying to drain an ocean with a cup. I crouched behind a barricade rifle, hot in my hands, power pack bleeding from green to amber to red. Sergeant Herrick tossed me a fresh one without looking away from the horde. His face was stone, not courage, not calm, just grim recognition we were drowning, and there was no shore. The first wave broke against us, bodies scattered across no man's land. We cheered, but orcs don't break, they just regroup. The second wave came an hour later, the third by midday, the fourth before sundown, each smaller than the last, but each carving away another piece of us. By evening our ammo was nearly gone, our dead stacked higher than the barricades we hid behind. That's when Colonel Vra made his decision. He called down orbital bombardment on our own positions. I was in the command bunker when it started. One moment our men in the forward trenches were fighting bayonets flashing in the dawn light. The next moment they were gone, vaporized along with their orc attackers in a wall of plasma fire. Efficient, tactical brilliance, also mass murder. We fell back under the cover of annihilation, half of us left behind in glowing craters. I could still smell the scorched air inside my rebreather, even as we stumbled into secondary defenses. They called it the Emperor's Mercy. It felt like betrayal. The orcs weren't finished. That night they came again, not in roaring charges, but in short rushes, ducking into rubble, using our craters for cover. They learned, they adapted, and still they came. 3 days of this, 3 days of firing until our rifles were empty, sleeping in minutes between assaults, carrying wounded men who begged to be left behind. By the fourth day, we knew it was over. Our heavy weapons sputtered, power drained. Our ammo was nearly gone. The green tide was endless, and we were grains of sand before a flood. And then the sky split. 3 thunderhawks screamed down like falling stars, tearing through clouds of smoke. They hit the orc lines with the fury of gods. Bolters barked thunder, chainswords sang, and in the midst of fire and ash strode the iron hands. Space Marines, angels of death, our saviors. Within an hour, the Waag was broken. Orcs scattered their war boss slain. Their game of war abruptly ended by professionals who treated the slaughter like routine maintenance. When it was over, 430 guardsmen were dead. The Iron Hands had lost none. Their sergeant gave Colonel Vra a nod, praise he called it, for acceptable resistance. High honors from their perspective. To us, it was ashes in the mouth. Acceptable. Tell that to the men atomized by our own guns. Tell it to the families of the 400 who bled out in ruins. We boarded the transport in silence, carried away to another war. The Iron Hands never looked back. For them, this was a skirmish. For us, it was a graveyard. I learned something on Karak's Prime, something I wish I could unlearn. Numbers don't matter in the Guard, not how many you kill, not how many die. What matters is that someone survives long enough to be sent to the next battlefield. Someone has to keep the meat grinder turning. I survived, That was my only accomplishment. Talon, even the name carried weight in the Guard. A desert world of endless dunes, scorching days that could boil a man alive, and nights so cold they cracked steel. The locals lived underground in cities carved into stone, emerging only when they had to. For them, the surface was a graveyard. For us, it was a battlefield. After Karak's Prime, my regiment was sent to reinforce the 12th Talon Desert Raiders. They had been fighting without pause for 3 years. By the time we arrived, they looked less like men and more like scarecrows held together by grit and rage. They had the 1,000-yard stare of veterans who no longer believed in victory, only in surviving the next dawn. Our new commander, Major Kellians, was their kind of leader. Where Colonel Vra had been a scalpel cold sharp, precise Kellians was a storm. Emotional, unpredictable, his orders often sounded more like gut instinct than military doctrine. His men loved him for it, and they died for him in numbers that would have made Vra smirk. Talon itself was a living enemy. Sandstorms rolled across the plains without warning, flaying skin, stripping paint, burying vehicles whole. Visibility dropped to meters, compasses spun aimlessly, Vox signals drowned in static. The air was poison, the creatures worse. Some burrowed beneath the dunes, rising without warning to drag screaming troopers into the earth. Others stalked at night, eyes, glinting red jaws, snapping bone like twigs. We learned quickly that Talon didn't care what insignia you wore. It killed Imperial and heretic Ork, and cultist alike. For 2 years I bled into that desert, fighting Ork raiders 1 week, chaos cultists the next, and sometimes fellow guardsmen who had gone feral after too long in the wasteland. The desert didn't just starve our bodies, it gnawed at our minds. The waiting was the worst, weeks spent staring at an empty horizon, nothing moving except waves of heat. Men who had fought pitched battles without flinching broke down under silence. The desert whispered created shapes in the distance, phantom voices carried on the wind. You could almost believe the sand itself was alive, watching, waiting. I was promoted to corporal after Sergeant Herrick died in a skirmish with cultists. The bullet passed through his throat before he could even draw a breath. One moment he was shouting orders, the next he was a body crumpled in red sand. They gave me his rank, his men, and his responsibilities. Leadership in the Guard is rarely earned. More often it is inherited by the simple fact that everyone above you is dead. With rank came a new duty, writing the letters. Every casualty required a message to their family. Your son died serving the Emperor. His sacrifice will not be forgotten. He met death with courage and dignity. The template was the same, only the names changed. At first, I tried to make them personal, adding details, memories, small pieces of truth. But after the 10th letter, then the 20th, then the 50th, the words blurred into meaningless ash. I lied to grieving mothers, lied to fathers who had already buried too many children, lied to wives and husbands whose futures collapsed in a single bolt round. They needed to believe their loved ones died for something greater. And it was my job to feed that illusion. My own guilt was irrelevant, but the cultists, they were something else entirely. The Orks were brutal but honest. They fought for violence for the joy of the kill. The cultists fought for madness. Humans twisted by promises of power, worshipping storms, worshipping pain, worshipping nothing at all. They poisoned wells, infected food supplies, planted traps in refugee camps. They turned prisoners into living bombs, slaves mind-wiped and wired with explosives sent stumbling into our lines to detonate in fire and blood. We called them heretics, but they were worse than that. They were mirrors. Proof of what we might become if faith curdled into fanaticism, if survival twisted into worship of the warp. The first time I saw a demon, I stopped believing that war was a contest of armies. It was something else, something larger, more obscene. We were sweeping an abandoned mining settlement, expecting cultists. And we found them, yes, screaming their chants in a language that tore at the edges of comprehension. But they had brought something with them. It stood 3 meters tall, shaped like a man if a man were made of shadow and knives. It moved like smoke, struck like lightning. Last fire did nothing. Grenades vanished into its form, as though swallowed by a black ocean. When it touched a man, he screamed once, and then collapsed, his body empty, his soul ripped away like parchment burned to ash. We fought it for 4 hours. 37 dead before we forced it back with concentrated fire. Each shot tearing pieces from its form until it shuddered and slipped screaming into the warp. But victory didn't taste like triumph. It tasted like blood and despair. The ground was corrupted. The air turned sour. Plants withered in days. The soil became sterile. Even machinery refused to function near the site. We were ordered to evacuate and call an orbital bombardment. 6 months later, sensors still twitched in its presence. That was when I understood we weren't fighting wars. We were fighting the universe itself, the laws of reality unraveling thread by thread. The Imperium was flawed, corrupt, brutal, but it was sane. And sanity, I realized, was the rarest resource in the galaxy. 2 years on, Talon left us broken husks, 87% casualty rate. By guard standards, it was considered acceptable. Acceptable like genocide on Heathguard. Acceptable like orbital strikes on Carax. Always acceptable because someone always survived to keep fighting. I survived. Again. But a part of me never walked out of that desert. When I close my eyes, I can still hear the wind whispering across dunes, promising madness. I still see Sergeant Herrick's blood steaming in the sand. I still hear the shrieks of the demon as it slipped away. Not destroyed, only waiting for another chance to crawl back into our world. The truth is, war doesn't just kill men. It hollows them out, leaves them walking shells. By the time we left Talon, I no longer recognized my own reflection. My eyes were older. My hands trembled even at rest. I wrote my letters without reading them. I gave orders without thinking. I survived without living. And that, more than the cultists, more than the demon, more than the desert itself, was the cruelest lesson Talon taught me. Survival is not victory. It is just endurance. And endurance has a price. Chapter 5. The Ghost Ship. After 2 years of desert hell on Talon ship duty sounded like paradise. The Navy told us we would patrol the shipping lane's guard convoys, maybe board a few pirate vessels. Compared to sandstorms and demons, it felt like a vacation. Clean water, regular meals, gravity that didn't flicker on and off, sleeping quarters with doors that actually closed. But peace is a lie. In the Guard, it always is. The Emperor's Wrath was a battlecruiser, sleek, and armored her crew professional and indifferent. To them, we were cargo grunt infantry, to be deployed when needed, ignored otherwise. We kept to our decks, ran drills, cleaned weapons, tried to forget the desert. Months of monotony passed. Cards, books, routine inspections, the kind of boredom that gnaws more than fear. Then came the signal. A raider had been harassing merchant vessels near the rim. We intercepted it after a brutal void battle that left both ships bleeding in the dark. The raider was once an Imperial frigate, but now its hull was tattooed with blasphemous symbols that seemed to shimmer even in the void. The order came down board secure salvage intelligence. Routine. Nothing about it was routine. The moment we crossed the airlock, the ship pressed in on us like a living thing. Corridors twisted at impossible angles. Walls breathing with subtle movement symbols, crawling like insects just beneath the metal. The air was heavy with whispers, words that hurt to hear syllables older than human speech. Half the squad froze. I wanted to freeze. We pushed forward anyway. The first chambers were empty, save for stains that refused to dry and shadows that shifted when we weren't looking. Then we found the crew. They had killed themselves. Hundreds of bodies arranged in patterns, too precise to be random, too grotesque to be sane. Circles, spirals, shapes that burned into the eyes until you couldn't look away. Some had carved their own flesh with symbols, their blood pooled into sigils that glowed faintly in the dark. The stench was indescribable, something beyond rot, like decay twisted with electricity and despair. The chapel was worse. Once it had been a place of worship for the Emperor. Now it was a shrine to nameless powers, Idols fashioned from bone and scrap metal leered down on us. Candles of human fat dripped across altars covered in black ichor. The floor was slick. The walls hummed. No one spoke. Our tech priest tried to access the cogitators. The machine spirits were screaming. Screens displayed geometries that defied reason. Speakers echoed voices that weren't human shrieks layered with laughter. Automated systems flickered alive just to terrify us, doors slamming, lights, strobing alarms, howling. Finally, we cut the power to silence it all. The dark was better than the voices. What we found in the captain's quarters shattered me more than anything else. Not relics, not demonic artifacts, files, personnel records, tactical dossiers, detailed psychological profiles of Imperial Guard units, including ours. My name was there, my record, my weaknesses. The fractures in my mind cataloged like a weapon schematic. They knew everything. How long before soldiers cracked under siege, which officers hesitated before ordering executions, which regiments broke faster than others. Chaos wasn't just madness, it was methodical. It studied us, understood us, and then used that knowledge to tear us apart. That was the forbidden truth. Our enemies weren't alien savages or gibbering lunatics. They were mirrors, twisted but deliberate. They knew us better than we knew ourselves, and that made them unstoppable. We spent 6 hours on that vessel, 6 hours that felt like 6 years, searching rooms that bent in impossible directions, passing objects that throbbed like hearts, finding journals written in human script that described in detail the exact nightmares we were living. By the end, half the squad refused to go deeper. They begged to be left behind. We withdrew with what intelligence we could carry, though calling it intelligence felt wrong. It was poison, knowledge that should never have existed. We returned to the Emperor's wrath, hollow-eyed, trembling, unable to speak of what we'd seen. The captain didn't ask for details. He ordered melta torpedoes fired at point-blank range. The raider blossomed into a star, its screams fading into silence. Official logs called it a successful interdiction. No mention of the shrine, no mention of the files, no mention of how many guardsmen requested transfer within a week. On paper, it was a victory. In truth, it was a scar. For me, it was worse than any Ork charge or chaos ambush. Those battles tested muscle and courage. This tested the mind. I realized that the most dangerous enemy wasn't outside our ranks, it was inside us. The human capacity for corruption, for betrayal, for transformation into something worse than alien. The Guard tells itself it fights for survival, but survival means nothing if you lose your soul. On that ship, I saw what it meant to win every battle and still lose the war. Even now, I can close my eyes and see the patterns made of bodies, hear the whispers in languages that scrape against bone, smell the candles made from human fat. And worst of all, I remember the files. My file, my life, my fears, my breaking points, all cataloged by an enemy that had been watching the whole time. The Emperor's wrath left the sector, weeks later, engines still groaning from battle damage. We moved on to the next assignment. That's the rhythm of the Guard. No time to grieve, no space to question, no pause to heal. Just another deployment, another battlefield, another lie about glory. But Talon had hollowed me, and the ghost ship had filled that hollow with something worse. Knowledge. And knowledge is the heaviest weapon of all. Chapter 6. The Siege of Home. Fate has a cruel sense of humor. After years of bleeding on alien sands, after deserts, demons, and void-born nightmares, I found myself sent back to Moria Prime, the same world where I'd been recruited as a gutter-born nobody. Only this time I wasn't crawling in the underhive. I was marching through the gates as a veteran sergeant of the Imperial Guard, ordered to defend the very manufactoria I had once worked in as a child laborer. Moria had changed in my absence, or maybe it had always been preparing for this. The skies were crowded with orbital defense platforms. Bunkers burrowed into the planet's crust like iron roots. Every citizen was conscripted factory workers turned into riflemen, school children, taught to strip and reassemble laser guns before they could read. It was no longer an industrial world. It was a fortress waiting for siege. And siege came in the form of Scarjaw the Despoiler, an orc war boss whose wah was said to number in the millions. They came with their ramshackle ships, their endless mobs, their crude artillery. But Scarjaw was different. He had learned. He had studied our wars and stolen our tactics. For the first time in memory, an orc invasion wasn't chaos. It was strategy. The first orbital bombardments gutted whole city districts, turning spires into smoking craters. Then the drop pods rained down, belching green-skinned killers directly into our defenses. But they didn't attack blindly. They struck comms, centers, supply depots, command bunkers. Every blow calculated, every loss acceptable. Scarjaw fought like an Imperial general, only with the cruelty of an orc. The first wave hit our sector at dawn, hundreds of orcs bellowing through smoke crashing against barricades reinforced with ferrocrete and sandbags. We poured disciplined fire into their ranks. The air shimmered with lass fire. Artillery thundered from the rear. By every measure of military science we should have held, but orcs don't break. They climbed over their own dead teeth, bared swinging crude choppas, even after their guts were spilling out. 6 hours later, my lasgun barrel warped from the heat. My sidearm was empty, my hands shook from exhaustion, and still they came. The breakthrough happened on our western flank, a weak point overlooked now, consumed by green fury. Hundreds of orcs poured through the gap, hitting us from behind, even as their comrades smashed the front. The order to retreat came too late. 70% of the 15th Moria shock troops died in a single day, their bodies trampled into rubble alongside civilian refugees. I lived, though I can't tell you how. Luck, maybe. Or cowardice disguised as survival. In the aftermath, they promoted me to sergeant, not for heroism, just because every sergeant before me was dead. From then on, the siege consumed us. 8 months of continuous fighting, 8 months of watching our food supplies dwindle, our ammunition vanish, our friends collapse one by one. The orcs controlled orbit, so no reinforcements came, no resupply. We were alone. The civilians fought beside us, children barely taller than their rifles, old men with trembling hands clutching grenades, women who had worked assembly lines yesterday, now charging barricades today. They died in droves, but none of us had the heart to tell them to stop. When survival becomes impossible, defiance is all that remains. By the 6th month, the orcs reached the hive's lower levels. If they captured the generator complex, the entire defense grid would collapse. Our orders were clear hold at all costs, which in military language meant die where you stand. The final battle was 3 days of unbroken horror, fighting in corridors choked with smoke and blood, improvised weapons, shovels, pipes, knives, because our rifles were long empty, civilians fighting beside guardsmen, their screams drowned by the roars of orcs who smelled victory. I killed my last orc with a combat knife. My lasgun was useless. Its pack drained, its barrel warped beyond recognition. The beast was taller than me, stronger, its crude axe already stained with blood. But the fight was close, too close for reach to matter. I stabbed again and again into chest, throat, eye, until its body finally gave way. It died smiling as if delighted by the contest, honest in its savagery. In that moment, I almost respected it. On the morning of the 4th day, salvation arrived, though salvation is never free. Drop pods screamed down from orbit, their hulls carved in yellow. Imperial fists. The Space Marines advanced through our ruined lines, their bolters shredding orc mobs like paper. In hours, the tide turned. In days, Scarjaw's way ag was shattered. We were liberated, they said. Victorious, they said. But victory was ash in our mouths. Out of 50,000 defenders, fewer than 4,000 survived. 92% casualties, civilians dead by the tens of thousands. The hive itself reduced to rubble manufactoria, a demolished industry crippled. By any rational measure, it was a catastrophic defeat disguised in the language of strategy. I received the Medallion Crimson for exceptional valor under extreme circumstances. A medal, a pension increase, and the right to wear a colored scrap of metal on my chest. The citation praised my leadership, my courage, my unwavering dedication to duty. It made no mention of the men who died under my command, the children who bled beside me, the families I failed to protect. That is the truth of medals in the Guard. They are not awarded to honor survival, but to justify loss. When the siege ended, the survivors were scattered to fill other regiments gutted by their own wars. Moria was left in ruins, its population broken, its future mortgaged in blood. I left my homeworld behind again, but this time not as a recruit. This time as a survivor of its death throes. And I knew then with a certainty that cut deeper than any blade, the Guard does not fight for victory. It fights to delay defeat. And on Moria, we delayed it for 8 months. That was our triumph. That was our punishment. 14 years, 16 worlds, 11 kinds of enemy. More comrades dead than I can count. And what did it all mean? Not victory, not glory, just survival stretched one more day at a time. The galaxy never grew safer, the wars never ended, the names on casualty lists only changed while the bloodstains remained the same. They say the Emperor protects. Perhaps he does, but not with miracles, not with angels descending from heaven. He protects through us, through exhausted guardsmen holding broken rifles, through civilians who choose to fight when hope is gone, through veterans who pass on their scars as warnings to the next recruits. We are not heroes. We are not legends. We are the thin line between civilization and madness antibodies in a body already infected. We bleed, we break, and we burn so others can sleep in ignorance for another night. That is the truth they never tell you when they hand you your first lasgun and call you a soldier. The truth that is worse than death itself, your life is no longer yours. It belongs to the war. The Emperor protects, and we protect the Emperor.